The rain came down in long dragging streaks against the windows of the Fairwood Police Department, a forgotten building tucked beside a shuttered bait shop and a condemned diner. Inside the station smelled of burnt coffee and old paperwork. Detective Neil Hargrove leaned against his desk, staring at the single bulb overhead that flickered like it had a grudge against light. The town had not changed in decades. The same chipped curbs, the same hollow streets, but Neil knew better than most that appearances lied, especially here. The call had come that morning not from dispatch or a sheriff, but from an old friend of his father's. A retired deputy named Victor Caro had found something while cleaning out his barn. A box, locked, old, no key, but the label was enough to stop Neil in his tracks. It read, Fairwood Case File 1978, subject Angela Moss. Angela Moss had vanished from her front porch at age 17. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no goodbyes, just gone. Neil was 8 at the time. His father, Detective Bill Hargrove, had worked the case with a kind of obsession that drove a wedge through their family. Neil remembered late nights, coffee cups stacked like towers, and his father muttering names that never made sense. By the time Bill died of a stroke in 1991, the case was cold as the riverbed where Angela's shoes were found. Neil had buried the file with his father, until now. Victor met him at the station just after noon. He was thinner than Neil remembered, bent like a question mark, but the eyes still carried fire. He placed the box on the desk like it weighed 100 pounds. Neil took his time prying it open. The latch gave with a reluctant click. Inside, the contents were carefully stacked. Old photographs, newspaper clippings, a map of the town with faded red circles, and a journal. Brown leather cracked at the spine. Neil opened the journal and felt something shift deep in his chest. The handwriting was his father's, sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably haunted. The entries were brief, notes mostly, observations about Angela's friends, mentions of a man named Calvin. Cross-referenced sightings. A name underlined 3 times on the final page. Vernon Hill. Neil leaned back in his chair watching the ceiling as if it might speak. Vernon Hill was the name of a hunter who had lived on the edge of town back then. He was questioned once but never charged. The town had whispered things, strange things, but no one had facts, only fear. The rain tapped harder. Neil lit a cigarette with the care of a man measuring time. He had quit years ago, but old cases made old habits feel justified. He stared at the last entry again. Vernon Hill, Angela, and something else scribbled faintly below. Calvin knows more than he admits. Calvin, his younger brother. The thought chilled him more than the weather. Calvin had grown up quiet, obedient, the golden boy of the family. He had left Fairwood early and risen fast in politics. Now a state senator, always polished, always distant, they had not spoken in almost 3 years. Their last conversation ended with a slammed door and a silence that calcified with time. But this name, this link, it cracked something open. Neil closed the journal and stood. The desk creaked. The floor groaned under his boots. Outside, the wind shifted, pulling the fog lower. Fairwood always looked like it held its breath in weather like this. Neil knew the town would not welcome old wounds reopened, but some wounds never closed. He took the journal home that night. His house sat on a rise above Willow Street where every porch light seemed dimmer than the last. Inside, he poured whiskey into a chipped glass and turned on the old tape deck. His father had left a dozen cassettes marked only with dates. He played one. The voice was gravel, calm. It was his father's. March 22nd. Watched Hill from the tree line. He dumped something behind the shed. Could not see what. Will return tomorrow. Neil listened for an hour. None of the tapes held definitive answers. Just tension, frustration, and fear. That was what startled him the most, the fear in his father's voice. Bill Hargrove was not a man who scared easy, but something in this case had shaken him. Neil could feel it like static in the air. That night, Neil dreamed of the old woods outside town. He saw Angela standing just beyond the trees, barefoot, mouth open, but silent. Behind her, shadows moved. One of them looked like his brother. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. The house was cold. The street outside was silent. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the journal open, a blank notebook beside it. He began writing his own notes, cross-checking, questioning, investigating. He made his first call to the county records office at 7, requested property records for Vernon Hill. He then called a retired officer who had worked the Moss case and agreed to meet the following afternoon. Piece by piece, the puzzle reassembled itself. Some pieces were warped, others did not fit at all, but a picture was emerging. By late afternoon, Neil stood at the edge of the old Moss residence. The house had been sold and sold again, now covered in ivy and silence. The porch steps groaned under his weight. He walked the perimeter. His eyes found the spot where the girl's shoes had been discovered. He knelt there, hand-brushing the earth. The clouds broke slightly. Light spilled across the yard in pale ribbons. In that moment, Neil felt the weight of time press down on him. 24 years was a long time for truth to hide, but it was still there, waiting. He stood, his breath steamed in the cold. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye in the overgrown flower bed. A small rusted chain. It looked like it belonged to a locket. He picked it up and pocketed it. Every small thing mattered now. Back at his car, he looked one last time at the house, then started the engine. The wind picked up. The radio crackled. The first line of his father's journal echoed in his head. Trust no one, not even those you love. Neil tightened his grip on the wheel. The past was no longer buried. It had started to speak, and he was listening. Neil arrived at the police station early the next morning. The clouds hung low, draping Fairwood in a thick mist that clung to the windows like breath on glass. The station felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that hinted at something unfinished. He poured stale coffee into a chipped mug and reviewed his notes from the night before. He circled 3 names in bold: Vernon Hill, Angela Moss, Calvin Hargrove. Then he glanced at the clock. It was just past 6. He told no one where he was going. He grabbed his keys, the case file, and the old journal and stepped into the fog. His car pulled out from the lot without sound, swallowed by the early morning silence. His destination was the cabin near the ridge, the same place his father had noted in one of the final cassette recordings. The path was narrow and lined with trees that seemed to lean too close, their branches dripping with the weight of mist. Neil knew these woods, but they felt different now, like something was waiting. He parked the car where the gravel turned to dirt and began the hike on foot. The trail had not been used in years. Ferns and fallen branches covered the path, and every few yards he had to push aside brambles that clawed at his jacket. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of town life faded completely. Only the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of an unseen tree remained. He found the cabin exactly where the map said it would be. Small, forgotten, with its wooden boards warped and gray with age. One window was shattered. The door sagged on its hinges. Neil stepped inside, boots crunching on broken glass. The air was musty and cold. He scanned the room with a flashlight, moving past overturned furniture and a rusted wood stove. On the far wall was a nail with a length of rope still tied in a loop. Under the floorboards, disturbed dust marked something recently moved. Neil knelt to pry it up. What he found underneath made his heart pause. Inside the shallow compartment was a tin box identical in make to the one Victor had given him. This one held Polaroid photographs, many of them water-damaged, but still visible. Angela appeared in several, always from a distance, as if she had been watched without knowing. In one, she stood in front of the town library, her expression distant. Another showed her at a gas station, laughing with friends. Then the photos changed. A girl with her back to the camera, a man in the shadows. One image caught Neil off guard. A figure just barely lit, standing in what looked like the basement of the Moss house. The outline was grainy but familiar. Neil narrowed his eyes. It was the jacket, the same kind Calvin had worn during the summer of '78. Neil stood quickly. The cabin felt like it was breathing. He pocketed the photographs and left the box where it was. There were too many questions now and not enough time. He stepped back into the woods, heart racing. Neil never made it back to his car. That much would be clear later. When the department began looking for him that evening, they found his vehicle parked near the trailhead. Engine off, doors locked. The keys were still in his coat pocket, which hung neatly over the driver's seat. A thermos of coffee sat unopened beside it. There were no signs of a struggle. No footprints leading away. A search was launched immediately involving volunteers, dogs, and drones. They combed the trail, the cabin, and the ravine for days. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a thread of clothing. Neil Hargrove had vanished the same way Angela Moss had, without a trace. Some believed he had gone into the woods intending not to return. Others suspected foul play. The timing was too precise. He had reopened a case everyone had buried. He had called names no one wanted to hear again. But the most disturbing detail came from one of the search volunteers. 3 days after Neil disappeared, a local hunter named George Massey reported something strange. He had been tracking deer on the upper ridge when he found a trail of fresh footprints in the mud. They matched Neil's boots. They led to a clearing by an old pine tree and simply stopped. No return prints. No sign of struggle. It was as if Neil had walked into the forest and then into thin air. The department labeled him missing in the line of duty. His name was added to the memorial wall. A service was held. Few attended. His brother Calvin gave a short speech about dedication and sacrifice, but his hands never stopped trembling as he spoke. Years passed. The case went cold again. Files were sealed, evidence misplaced. The old journal vanished from the records room. Only a handful of people still remembered Neil Hargrove and the case he would not let go. But in the summer of 2014, a janitor named Raymond Pike made a routine sweep of the police archive basement. A rusted cabinet had jammed shut for years, wedged behind a leaking pipe. Curious, Raymond forced it open and found an unmarked folder inside. It held maps, transcripts, and a handwritten note signed by Neil. The note was addressed to himself. It read simply, "If you find this, then the lie was deeper than I thought. Start at the beginning. Look for the pattern. Do not trust what you are told." Raymond handed the file to a young officer who logged it into evidence. The note was dismissed as the ramblings of a detective unraveling under pressure. But another envelope fell out days later, tucked behind the drawer. It was labeled with a name no one recognized, L. Weston. Inside were photographs, the same kind Neil had found. One photo stood out. It was dated 3 weeks before Neil vanished. It showed a man standing near the cabin. His face was turned away, but the build, the haircut, the posture, they all matched one person in particular. State Senator Calvin Hargrove. A formal inquiry was suggested, but quickly denied. Too much time had passed. Too little evidence remained. The official record stayed unchanged. Neil was missing, presumed dead. No foul play suspected. But among those who knew him best, a different truth remained. Neil had found something, and someone had made sure he would not come back. The Fairwood County Records Office sat beneath the shadow of the courthouse, a squat beige building with blinds always half closed and a reception desk staffed by someone who never looked up. One Tuesday morning, Sarah Wilkins, a part-time file clerk barely out of college, was assigned to clear out a stack of unindexed case records that had been shoved into a back room during a leak repair. The room smelled of mold and forgotten intentions. As she pulled boxes from the shelves, her hand caught on a rusted cabinet door. It creaked open to reveal a mess of folders, many unmarked. At the bottom, sealed in a plastic sleeve, was a bundle labeled in faded black marker with the initials NH and the year 1990. Sarah placed it on a rolling cart without thinking much of it. Later that afternoon, when cataloging the files, she skimmed the contents and paused. There were maps, scribbled timelines, photographs of the old Moss house, and a leather-bound journal with pages covered in neat, slanted handwriting. She noted the name Neil Hargrove in the database and placed the journal aside. Her supervisor would know what to do with it. Word of the discovery traveled slowly through the department, reaching the desk of Lieutenant Eric Denton, one of the few remaining officers who had known Neil personally. Eric was a man shaped by quiet routines and reluctant memories. When he saw the name on the evidence tag, his hands froze. He requested the file be brought to him. After hours behind closed doors, Eric read through the journal. The entries were intense but methodical. They chronicled Neil's return to the Angela Moss case, his doubts about official reports, and his growing suspicion that the original investigation had been compromised. Most striking of all was the final page where Neil scrawled 3 sentences in all caps. Calvin lied. I followed him to the ridge. He was not alone. Eric read that line several times. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long while. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number he had not used in over a decade. An hour later, at a quiet diner on the edge of town, Eric met with Gloria Raines, a former crime scene photographer who had retired early after a heart condition. Gloria had been on the Moss case, snapping pictures of evidence that at the time seemed ordinary. Eric slid a photograph across the table. It showed a girl in a high school cheer uniform. She stood on a street corner near a bookstore that had since closed. In the background was a black pickup truck. Gloria narrowed her eyes and shook her head. She remembered taking that photo, but the truck had never been part of the report. She leaned closer and traced the outline of the license plate with her finger. Then she whispered something that chilled Eric. That was Bill Hargrove's truck. That was Neil's father. Eric did not respond right away. He opened the journal and pointed to an earlier entry. Neil had written about his father's long absences in the weeks before Angela disappeared. There was mention of late-night drives and a hidden ledger. Eric and Gloria sat in silence, the buzz of the diner growing distant. The new pieces did not fit with the story they had been told. The old detective's obsession might not have been only professional. It might have been personal. Eric folded the journal closed and slid it back into the sleeve. He told Gloria he would look into the ledger next. She nodded, but said nothing. Outside, the clouds had darkened. A storm was coming. 3 days later, Eric received an email from the county library archives. A retired historian had stumbled upon a box of property documents during a community project to digitize old zoning maps. One folder stood out. It was labeled Hargrove and dated 1977. Inside were property tax receipts, a hand-drawn map of undeveloped land near the Fairwood ravine, and a single sheet detailing a cash transaction involving a private storage unit under a different name. The name was Leonard Weston. Eric recognized it from the envelope Sarah had found. The address matched a now demolished storage facility that had once stood near the industrial park. What disturbed Eric most was the note at the bottom of the sheet. In his father's tight cursive, Neil had written the words "second key" behind the bricks under the south wall. Eric took the afternoon off. He drove to the site where the storage units had stood. The area was now overgrown, fenced off with rusted chain link and posted signs that warned against trespassing. He ignored them. He climbed over the barrier and began searching the southern perimeter. After an hour of brushing aside weeds and debris, he found what he was looking for. A line of bricks still stood, remnants of a foundation. He knelt and removed the lowest brick. Behind it was a small rusted key wrapped in wax paper. Eric held it in his hand for a long moment. This had been hidden here for decades. Why? That night he visited his father's old friend Raymond Knox, who once worked maintenance for the storage site. Raymond was nearly blind now and mostly bedridden. But his memory was sharp. When Eric showed him the key and the name Leonard Weston, Raymond nodded slowly. He remembered the unit. It was number 19. A man paid in cash every month and only visited at night. Raymond never saw what was stored inside. He had assumed it was hunting gear or maybe old furniture. He was wrong. Raymond coughed into a handkerchief and asked Eric why he wanted to know. Eric did not answer. He drove back to the station and spent the rest of the night reading every page of Neil's journal again. The next morning, he entered the basement evidence room and searched through the contents of the Weston envelope. The photographs now made a strange kind of sense. One image in particular revealed a detail he had missed before. A familiar face appeared in the reflection of a glass cabinet behind Angela at a school event. The man was older, balding, with sharp eyes. Eric enlarged the photo on the department scanner. The timestamp confirmed it was taken just 2 weeks before Angela vanished. The reflection was blurry, but clear enough for Eric to identify. It was Vernon Hill, the same man Neil had mentioned visiting near the ridge. But Vernon had an alibi. The department had dismissed him. Eric pulled his personnel file. The alibi came from a single phone call to an out-of-state cousin. No one had verified it. Eric Denton did not sleep the night he identified Vernon Hill in the photograph. The image haunted him not only because of what it showed, but because of what it implied. If Vernon had been watching Angela, then the idea of him being cleared so quickly all those years ago began to feel less like oversight and more like intentional omission. Eric drove through the quiet Fairwood streets lit only by flickering street lamps and the occasional porch light. His thoughts kept circling one name, Calvin Hargrove. Neil's younger brother had built a public image so polished that even in Fairwood people often forgot he had once been just a quiet boy in a small town. Eric remembered him vaguely, always proper, always composed. But there had been something distant in his eyes even as a teenager, something that never quite warmed. Eric knew Calvin had returned to town just before Neil disappeared. The timing felt too perfect. The next morning, Eric met with Gloria again, this time at the back table of the library, far from curious eyes. He laid out the photos and journal entries. Gloria listened carefully as Eric connected the dots between Neil's last known investigation and Calvin's return visit. Gloria hesitated before speaking. She remembered seeing Calvin at the library one evening in 1990 around the time Neil had started asking too many questions. He had not come to read or research. He had only spoken briefly with a local boy, then disappeared into the archive room for almost an hour. The next day, several microfilm reels had gone missing. No one thought much of it. Gloria now wondered if those reels had held early newspaper mentions of Angela's case or perhaps mentions of Calvin himself. Eric thanked her and copied the details into his notebook. The pattern Neil had written about was starting to take shape. Later that week, Eric arranged an informal conversation with a retired school counselor named Madeline Shore. She had worked at Fairwood High during the late 70s and early 80s and had an uncanny memory for students. When Eric asked about Angela Moss, Madeline's expression tightened. She remembered Angela as bright and soft-spoken, but said the girl had shown signs of anxiety in her final semester. Madeline pulled out an old manila envelope of files she had kept over the years, mostly for personal reasons. One of them bore Angela's name. Inside was a copy of a letter Angela had written but never mailed. It was addressed to someone she called C, and the language was desperate. She wrote about being followed, watched from across the street, someone tapping on her window at night. The letter ended with a plea for the person to stop. Eric asked Madeline if she had any idea who C might have been. She nodded solemnly. Angela had a short-lived connection with Calvin Hargrove during his senior year. It was never public. She suspected Angela's parents did not approve. That revelation unsettled Eric. The family dynamics were more twisted than anyone had admitted. Angela, the girl who vanished, had reached out to Calvin in fear. Neil had likely discovered the same thing, perhaps too late. Eric drove to the state records office and requested permission to access sealed case files tied to the Hargrove family, specifically those related to campaign audits and property ownership. As he waited for processing, he wandered through the building and came across a public exhibit on political history. One photograph near the end caught his attention. It showed Calvin at a charity event in 1990, shaking hands with a sponsor. In the background, a familiar figure leaned against a fence. It was Vernon Hill. The photograph had a date stamp, April 18, 1990. That was 1 week before Neil vanished. Eric took a picture of the exhibit and left without signing the guest book. He drove back to Fairwood with his hands clenched on the wheel. That night, he reviewed everything again. The photos, the journal. Angela's letter, the witness recollections. One connection stood out. Calvin had returned to Fairwood during the height of Neil's investigation. Vernon Hill, who had been supposedly uninvolved for years, had also resurfaced. Angela's missing posters had been quietly removed from downtown buildings during that month, and Neil had followed someone to the ridge the night he vanished. That someone Eric now believed was Calvin. Eric knew he needed confirmation. He reached out to a contact at a local bank who owed him a favor. He requested discreet access to records associated with Leonard Weston, the alias tied to the storage unit. What the bank provided stunned him. Monthly payments had been withdrawn from a trust account under the name of C. Hargrove, with authorization beginning in 1989 and ending exactly 1 month after Neil disappeared. The payments had covered the rental of several off-site units, including the one near the ridge. Eric now had financial proof linking Calvin to the hidden unit Neil had tried to uncover. Still, no arrest could be made without direct evidence of wrongdoing. Calvin's public image was untouchable. But Eric was no longer chasing justice in the legal sense. He wanted truth. He wanted the story Neil never got to tell. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. An anonymous envelope arrived at Eric's house containing a single cassette tape. It was labeled April 20th, 1990. The handwriting was shaky. The voice on the tape belonged to Neil. In the recording, Neil described tailing Calvin to a house on Pine Hollow Drive, a property owned by an out-of-state shell company. Neil spoke quietly, clearly hiding as he recorded. He described seeing Vernon Hill arrive and enter the home. He then noted Calvin handing over what looked like a black bag. The final words on the tape were urgent. "If I do not make it back, look at the cabin, behind the second wall." Eric listened to the tape 5 times. He knew the Pine Hollow house. It had been condemned years ago, boarded up after a fire. But the mention of the cabin was more important. The same cabin Neil had visited before disappearing. The police had searched it years ago. But no one had ever looked behind a wall. The path to the cabin was even more overgrown than it had been decades earlier. Vines had taken over the trail, and moss crept along every trunk like time reclaiming what people had once abandoned. Eric parked near the old forestry gate and carried only what he needed. A flashlight, Neil's journal, the cassette player, and a crowbar. The storm from the night before had soaked the forest floor. Each step sank into damp earth, and birds scattered from the underbrush as Eric moved deeper into the trees. He had walked this trail as a child during summer outings, but now every branch seemed to lean toward him like a silent witness. The weight of the moment pressed down with each footfall. When he reached the clearing, the cabin stood in its quiet decay. One side had caved in, exposing old insulation and broken beams, but the structure still held. Eric stepped inside. The air was heavier than before. Dust particles floated like ash in his flashlight beam. He headed for the back wall. That was where Neil had said to look. Behind the second wall, Eric began tapping along the planks, listening for hollow sounds. After several minutes of knocking, he found it. One section near the corner gave off a dull echo. The boards were nailed into a crude frame that stood just inches in front of the real wall. With slow, deliberate effort, he wedged the crowbar under one board and pulled. The wood groaned, splintered, and finally gave way. Behind it was another wall of darker wood. In the gap between, tucked into a plastic bag nailed into the beam, was a small red notebook. Eric took it out gently. The cover was cracked from moisture but intact. Inside, the pages were densely filled in Neil's handwriting. This was not the same journal recovered by Sarah at the station. This one had never been archived. It was Neil's final entries, all written in the days leading up to his disappearance. Eric sat on the cold wooden floor and began to read. The entries started with Neil describing Calvin's frequent visits to the ridge and the shell property on Pine Hollow Drive. He documented license plates, timestamps, and interactions that Calvin had tried to keep private. One entry described a confrontation. Neil had followed Calvin into town and witnessed a heated exchange between him and an older man Neil believed to be Vernon Hill. The words used in the entry suggested threats, desperation, and guilt. Neil suspected they had been hiding more than just Angela's disappearance. Another entry, dated just 2 days before Neil vanished, detailed plans to revisit the cabin with photographic evidence. Neil wrote that he intended to bring everything he had to the district attorney's office, but feared he would be intercepted. He had hidden backup copies in 3 locations, and this notebook was one of them. His final words on the last page were simple but chilling. "I am being watched. If they find me, they will bury this." Eric packed the notebook into his backpack and took one last look around the ruined cabin. As he stepped outside, his foot caught on something beneath the leaves. It was a strip of faded blue fabric almost invisible against the forest floor. He bent down and pulled it free. It was a shirt sleeve, the kind issued by the Fairwood Police Department in the late 80s. Dirt and rot had eaten away the lower portion, but the shoulder patch was still visible. Eric turned it over and froze. Inside the sleeve was a tarnished badge. It had Neil's number on it. Eric stood there for a long moment, clutching the fabric, the trees around him dead silent. There was no mistaking it. This was where Neil had fallen or had been taken. The air felt colder now, more personal. Eric photographed everything before continuing toward the trailhead. He moved quickly, now the light fading behind the trees. Back at the station, Eric locked the notebook and the badge in the evidence room and filed a private report. He knew the discovery should have triggered a full investigation. He also knew what would happen if it did. Files would be lost. Witnesses would change their stories. Calvan had allies in powerful places. Eric could not afford to go through official channels. He needed leverage. That night, he contacted Rachel Holt, a former assistant district attorney who had left her post after uncovering corruption in a different county. She agreed to meet him quietly. Over coffee in a diner miles outside Fairwood, Eric showed her the notebook. Rachel read silently for several minutes before closing it and pressing her fingers to her temples. She told Eric this was enough for a grand jury, but only if they moved quickly and discreetly. Eric nodded. They would need more than paper. They needed a witness. Someone who had seen what happened the night Neil disappeared. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. A geologist working with the Department of Natural Resources reported a landslide near the ravine behind the ridge. While surveying the area, his assistant had found what appeared to be bone fragments among exposed roots. Police were notified, and Eric managed to get to the scene first. The remains were partial, deeply weathered, but dental records confirmed what he already knew. They belonged to Angela Moss. She had not vanished. She had died. And someone had buried her at the edge of the forest, just far enough away to avoid suspicion. With this discovery, the case could no longer be buried. News broke within days. Fairwood held its breath. At the press conference, Eric chose his words carefully. He confirmed the remains had been identified and that the investigation had reopened. Reporters asked about the possibility of foul play. Eric neither confirmed nor denied. When the cameras shut off, he received a message slipped under his office door. It contained an address, a time, and no signature. The handwriting matched an old witness statement from the Vernon Hill interview decades ago. The meeting was set for 3 nights later near the abandoned rail yard. Eric did not hesitate. He would go alone. The night of the meeting arrived cold and damp, with low fog crawling along the broken tracks near the abandoned Fairwood rail yard. Eric parked his unmarked sedan several blocks away and walked the final stretch alone. The rail yard had once been a bustling depot in the 1960s, but now stood forgotten, its metal skeletons rusting into the earth. Eric's breath rose in pale clouds as he approached the designated boxcar, the one tagged with faded numbers and a bent iron latch. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust. A single lantern glowed at the center of the space, and beside it stood a man with deep lines on his face and hands that trembled. Eric recognized him immediately. Gerald Brunner had been Vernon Hill's cousin and once worked as a groundskeeper at the Fairwood County shooting range. Gerald had disappeared from public life after Vernon's questioning. His eyes now avoided Eric's as he gestured for silence and reached into a duffel bag. He pulled out a worn cassette recorder and placed it on the ground between them. Then, without a word, he pressed play. The tape began to spin and a voice crackled through the speaker. The voice belonged to Neil Hargrove. It was unmistakable. His tone was calm but taut, like a man trying to anchor his sanity to paper. He spoke of his suspicions of following Calvin late at night to the Pine Hollow house. He described the presence of Vernon Hill and someone else whose identity he could not confirm. The most chilling portion of the recording came when Neil began to narrate events in real time. He whispered about being inside the cabin, about finding the photographs, about hearing footsteps outside just before the tape cut abruptly. Gerald stepped back as the silence settled. Eric asked where he had found it. Gerald answered slowly, saying he had been paid to retrieve the recorder after Neil went missing but had kept it instead. He had not trusted the man who hired him. He never knew if what he did was the right thing, only that keeping the tape out of the wrong hands felt important. Now, with Angela's body found and names returning to the surface, he believed it was time to come forward. Eric nodded and thanked him, his mind already racing. Back at the station, Eric transferred the contents of the tape to digital format and stored the original in the secure vault. The timeline on the recording aligned with entries in Neil's hidden notebook and with the final call logs pulled from Calvin's private number. The links were no longer circumstantial. Eric drafted a confidential report and sent it directly to Rachel Holt. Her reply was brief and urgent. She instructed Eric to prepare for closed-door testimony before a panel of federal investigators in Portland. She would handle the legal barriers. Eric understood the risk. The moment this case reached federal level, Calvin's power would be threatened. If he had orchestrated Neil's disappearance to protect himself before he would act again. Still, Eric packed the documents, the audio files, and a flash drive of the Angela Moss autopsy. He left the house just after sunrise and made the drive north along Highway 5, his hands tightening every time a vehicle lingered too long in his rearview mirror. In Portland, Eric met the panel in a nondescript federal office, the kind with no nameplates and walls too white to feel welcoming. Rachel led the questioning. Each member of the panel listened intently as Eric laid out the sequence of events, playing excerpts from Neil's tape and quoting entries from the notebook. When he finished, there was a long pause before one of the agents asked about Calvin Hargrove's current location. Eric replied that the senator had flown to Washington, D.C. the previous morning for a scheduled ethics hearing unrelated to this matter. Rachel confirmed the travel records. The agents conferred briefly, then informed Eric that they would need to place protective measures around both him and Gerald. A subpoena for Calvin's financial records and private communications would follow. Eric left the building with a tightness in his chest. For the first time, he saw the full weight of what Neil had been fighting. It was not just about a girl who vanished or a brother who lied. It was about control. It was about power buried under charm and privilege and decades of silence. Later that evening, as Eric sat in his motel room outside Salem, his phone vibrated with an encrypted message. The contents were brief but explosive. A journalist from an independent outlet had received an anonymous tip about Angela Moss and Neil Hargrove. The reporter was requesting a meeting. Eric hesitated, wary of exposure, but realized the time for secrecy had passed. He responded with a neutral address and set the time for early morning. That night, he reviewed the tape again. Near the end of Neil's narration, just before the recording cut out, another voice could be heard faintly in the background. Eric isolated the audio, cleaned it with software, and enhanced the frequency. The voice was deep, angry, and very clear. It said the words, "Get rid of him." Then the tape clicked off. Eric sat back in his chair. It was not Calvin's voice. It belonged to someone else, someone older. Someone who had remained hidden. He played it again. This time he noticed something else. A faint echo of the name Bill. The morning air in Fairwood was heavy with moisture as Eric returned from Salem, his mind crowded with the voice on the tape. The word Bill echoed again and again, dragging him deeper into a part of the case he had tried to avoid. If the voice belonged to Bill Hargrove, Neil's father, then this case was no longer just about a political corruption. It was about family, It was about legacy. Back at the station, Eric pulled out the old departmental files from the late 70s requesting specific notes from the original Angela Moss investigation. Many reports were scanned poorly or marked incomplete. Among them was a memo from a school faculty member dated 2 weeks before Angela disappeared. The name on the memo was June Holloway, a literature teacher at Fairwood High. The report claimed that Angela had seemed withdrawn and frightened in her last days. Eric searched for more, but the files ended abruptly. That afternoon, he tracked down June, now retired and living in a quiet home on the edge of town. She greeted him with cautious eyes and an old woman's patience. They sat in her living room as the grandfather clock ticked softly behind them. June did not hesitate once Eric explained why he had come. She reached into a drawer and handed him a diary. It had belonged to Angela. June said she had found it in Angela's locker during the cleanup after her disappearance. She had turned over some pages to the police, but had kept the rest believing the girl had confided things too personal to become evidence. The diary was fragile, its pages curled from time. Eric began reading, his hands careful not to tear the paper. Angela wrote of strange calls with no one, speaking a car parked outside her house at odd hours, and dreams where she woke up in places she did not recognize. One entry described a man who knew things about her family that he should not have known. She referred to him as A.M. Angela never gave his full name, but what startled Eric was a passage where she mentioned Neil by name. She said Neil had warned her once, said she needed to stay away from someone close to him. As Eric read further, a pattern emerged. Angela seemed terrified not just of being watched, but of being manipulated. She believed someone was making others around her act strangely. Teachers who once defended her avoided her in hallways. Friends stopped returning calls. The only constant presence, she wrote, was Calvin. She described him as charismatic, gentle in public, but sometimes distant and cold when alone. The last few entries took a darker turn. Angela wrote that she had seen Calvin arguing with an older man in the woods behind the school. She hid behind trees and heard only fragments. The man told Calvin that mistakes cost everyone. Calvin had responded that it was already too late. Angela never wrote again after that entry. The date was exactly 1 day before she vanished. Eric closed the diary and looked at June. She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. She said she should have come forward years ago, but had been told by someone at the department to keep quiet. She never knew why. Eric returned to the station with the diary and copied the pages. He called Rachel Holt and explained what he had found. She listened in silence, then asked him to keep the original secure and send her digital copies. As he was preparing the scan, another officer walked into his office holding an envelope. It had been mailed with no return address and bore only his name in careful handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, taken from what appeared to be a school yearbook archive. It showed a young Calvin Hargrove, Angela Moss, and a third person standing in the background. Eric magnified the image. The man in the background wore a trench coat and stood with arms crossed near a faculty entrance. His face was partly shadowed, but his outline was unmistakable. It was Bill Hargrove. The timestamp on the photo matched the year Angela was a junior. That meant Bill had been on school grounds long after he was officially pulled from the case. There was no departmental record of his presence. No follow-up. No justification. Eric felt his stomach turn. He began revisiting Bill's old case files, pulling out personal notes, timesheets, and assignment logs. Something was wrong. Several pages were written with different pens and signatures did not match. He called in a forensic analyst to examine the writing. The preliminary findings confirmed Eric's suspicion. Some of the notes had been altered. The changes aligned with dates connected to Angela's investigation. One alteration removed Vernon Hill's name from a location log. Another reassigned officer duties the week Angela disappeared. Eric realized that whoever had protected Calvin had started with Bill. Whether Bill had done it willingly or had been blackmailed remained unclear, but the truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was written down. It had been read, and now it was impossible to ignore. He brought this new evidence to Rachel Holt and pushed for an emergency review. She informed him that a federal investigator had begun building a closed indictment based on the journal, the tape, the badge, and now the diary. They still needed someone who had seen the events firsthand. Gerald Bruner's testimony was essential but incomplete. He had never seen a body. He had only retrieved a tape, but Angela's diary hinted that someone else had known, someone who had watched from the sidelines. Rachel and Eric discussed the possibility that there were more recordings. If Neil had left one tape, there could be others, possibly hidden where no one had looked, possibly marked under a name no one had questioned. Eric returned to the Fairwood Police Archives. He searched for audio evidence filed under aliases or unrelated case numbers. Hours passed. Then he found it. A box labeled 1978 local vandalism reports. Inside were cassettes, some broken, some pristine. One tape was labeled Field Interview 6B. He played it. A voice spoke clearly. It was a teenager describing a strange man watching students behind the school. The boy mentioned hearing the name Angela. Then he said something Eric had not expected. He said the man drove a car that belonged to the father of the detective on her case. The recording Eric discovered in the vandalism box had been misplaced for decades. It featured a boy named Matthew Cleary, a freshman in 1978, who had filed several reports about strangers loitering near school grounds. His voice on the tape was young but serious. He described seeing a man with thinning hair and a long coat frequently parked in the same spot behind the gym. He mentioned the man speaking with another student and said he once heard Angela's name, followed by what sounded like a warning. He had tried to tell school officials, but no one followed up. The most jarring detail came at the end when Matthew described the vehicle. It matched the exact make and color of Bill Hargrove's station wagon, which had been registered to the department and used unofficially during off hours. Eric played the tape twice more. Each time the knot in his stomach tightened. This was not just a case of missed signs. This was a case of deliberate avoidance. Someone had buried Matthew's statement so deeply it had taken Eric weeks of random cross-referencing to find it. And the boy had never been interviewed again. Eric requested help from Rachel Holt to locate Matthew Cleary. It took several days, but they found a man living under a different name in a small Oregon town near the border. His new identity had been part of a witness protection program for unrelated reasons. With proper clearance, Eric arranged a meeting at a neutral federal facility. Matthew, now in his 50s, walked with a slight limp and wore a hat low over his brow. When they sat across from each other, Eric placed the tape recorder on the table and hit play. Matthew closed his eyes. When the audio finished, he nodded and quietly confirmed the story. He had seen Bill Hargrove near the school multiple times during the spring of 1978. He had watched him speak to Calvin in hurried tones, and once saw Angela recoil when the man approached her. He had been too young then to understand what he was witnessing, but he remembered the fear on Angela's face. He remembered how quickly the adults made him stop talking. Matthew agreed to provide a signed affidavit and allowed his voice to be recorded again for comparison. He also mentioned one more detail. A week before Angela disappeared, he had broken into a maintenance shed behind the science wing on a dare. Inside, he saw something odd. A row of boxes marked with the dates and initials. He remembered seeing one with the initials CH and another with the name Moss written in faded marker. He had assumed they were lost and found materials or school files. But now he realized they may have been evidence of something else. Matthew never told anyone about the boxes, not even when questioned. He feared they would twist his story or silence him permanently. Hearing about Neil's disappearance only confirmed his fears. He had disappeared trying to do what Matthew could not. He had pushed too close to the truth. Eric returned to Fairwood with Matthew's statement and the tape. He went straight to the old high school grounds, now partially demolished as part of a reconstruction project. The science wing remained, though it had been shuttered due to asbestos concerns. Eric obtained clearance and entered the shed Matthew had described. The interior was mostly empty now, filled with plastic chairs and dusty file cabinets. He examined each cabinet slowly until he found one that had been bolted shut. With the help of a crowbar, he forced it open. Inside were old film reels, a box of photographs, and several folders. One folder bore the initials CH, another marked with moss and red ink. Eric opened the latter first. Inside were printed sheets from the guidance office, early drafts of disciplinary reports that had never been filed, and several Polaroid photographs. One showed Angela walking alone behind the school. Another depicted Calvin seated at the bleachers with a man partially cropped out. The visible sliver of the man's coat matched the one Bill had been seen wearing in earlier photos. The box marked CH contained campaign flyers from Calvin's first city council run, but beneath them was something else. A cassette labeled Practice Session. Eric played it on the school's outdated audio machine. It was a recording of a mock debate, but the background conversation caught his attention. As the mock debate ended, the microphone picked up Calvin's voice in conversation with another male. The words were muffled, but clear enough to discern that they were speaking about Angela. Calvin said she was going to ruin everything. The second voice replied that she needed to be handled before it became a problem. Eric recognized the second voice. He had heard it on Neil's last tape. It was Bill. This was the final piece he needed. The confession was not formal. It was not intended to be recorded. But it existed. It proved that both Calvin and Bill had discussed silencing Angela before her disappearance. And somehow Neil had suspected his father's involvement. That was why Neil had kept digging until he vanished. The evidence Eric uncovered had moved beyond whispers and suspicion. The moment he submitted the audio recordings, Matthew Cleary's affidavit, Angela's diary, and the recovered photographs to the federal task force wheels began to turn. The documentation was precise. Names were no longer implied. They were stated. Conversations between Calvin and Bill Hargrove revealed intent. The timeline matched Neil's final notes, and Angela's voice echoed through every piece of the puzzle. Rachel Holt contacted Eric late in the evening and informed him that the indictment was being prepared. The charges would be sealed until all individuals involved could be brought in safely. For the first time, Eric felt the full gravity of what Neil must have carried alone. The weight of family, of betrayal, and of truth that no one wanted to see. He stared out his kitchen window into the black night. Somewhere in that darkness, someone else might still be listening. Eric had stopped locking his emotions away, but now he started locking his doors. The following morning, news broke through a leak to a national outlet. The article was carefully worded but hinted at new developments in the decades-old Angela Moss disappearance. It cited an internal investigation, unnamed federal sources, and the implication of former police officers and a current state senator. The internet reacted instantly. Hashtags emerged. Old photos of Angela resurfaced. Journalists descended on Fairwood like flies to sugar. Calvin Hargrove issued a statement that denied all accusations. He described the news as a political attack and warned of legal consequences for slander. His demeanor on camera was sharp and unwavering, but something in his eyes betrayed him. Behind the polished speech and tailored suit there was unease. The town responded in waves. Some supported Calvin, convinced he was a victim of smear politics. Others, mostly the older families who remembered Angela, began asking questions they had buried for years. One woman left a bouquet of yellow daisies at the steps of the school, whispering that the town owed her that much. Behind the scenes, the federal task force moved quickly. They issued a warrant for Calvin's private estate and seized archived materials from his campaign offices. At the same time, Bill Hargrove was placed under protective custody at a medical care facility where he had been living under his brother's name. He had grown frail, his memory affected by age and illness, but when shown the photograph of Angela, he lowered his head. No one needed a confession at that moment. His silence was loud enough. Eric attended the search at the Hargrove estate. The team uncovered locked cabinets, burned documents, and a safe that contained several cassette tapes. One was marked May 2nd, 1990. Eric played it with gloves and headphones. The tape began with background static, then the faint sound of footsteps. Calvin's voice emerged arguing with someone. He accused the other person of making a mess of not following the plan. The response was quiet but unmistakable. It was Bill trying to calm his son. The final minute of the tape ended with the phrase Eric would never forget. "They will never find her." As agents combed the property, Rachel met with a judge to expedite the indictment. The pressure from media had become overwhelming. Leaks had compromised the timeline. If they waited, evidence could be destroyed. Rachel requested that both Calvin and his legal team be placed under immediate observation. The judge approved it. That evening, Calvin was brought in for a voluntary interview. He arrived with 2 attorneys and maintained a cold, polite tone. He denied knowing Angela Moss beyond school circles. He denied involvement in Neil's disappearance. When shown the tapes, he questioned their authenticity. When played the audio of his father's voice, he sat still and offered no reaction. Only once did he speak outside of prepared statements, when Eric asked him why Angela had feared him. Calvin leaned forward and whispered that some people were simply not strong enough for the truth. That phrase would echo through headlines the following week. The public shift was fast and brutal. Supporters began to distance themselves. Campaign donors pulled funding. An emergency ethics hearing was scheduled. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. News outlets replayed old footage of Angela, her smile frozen in time. Others dug into Neil's legacy, turning his disappearance into a national mystery once again. Gerald Bruner's testimony was leaked. Angela's diary was quoted in evening broadcasts. Even the forgotten tapes from the vandalism shed made their way into podcasts and documentaries. For many, the pain reopened. But for some, it felt like healing. A part of the town that had been frozen for over 2 decades was beginning to thaw. Beneath the outrage and noise, there was a quiet acknowledgement that truth had not died. It had only been waiting. Eric kept working through the chaos. He received an envelope without a return address. Inside was a copy of Neil's original hand-drawn map, but this version had an additional marking, a red circle near the ridge far from where Angela's remains had been found. Eric followed it 2 days later, moving through the thick brush and climbing over uneven terrain. He reached a flat stretch of land hidden behind overgrowth. Buried beneath a pile of old fence posts was a shallow container wrapped in waterproof canvas. Inside were more photographs. One showed Angela at a local diner. Another revealed a car parked outside the cabin with the door ajar. The final photo sent a chill down Eric's spine. It was Neil. His face looked directly into the camera, but his eyes showed fear. Behind him, standing in shadow, was a tall figure wearing a coat that matched the one Bill had worn in every confirmed image. The sun hung low over Fairwood as Eric stood once more at the edge of the ridge. The final photograph he had found remained tucked in the inside pocket of his coat, its weight a reminder of the cost of silence. He had not shown it to anyone yet. Not Rachel, not the task force, not even the media outlets clamoring for one more revelation. This one felt different. This one belonged to Neil. The look on Neil's face, framed by pine needles and shadow, had etched itself into Eric's memory. There was no doubt now that Neil had known who was following him. There was no doubt that the final hours of his life had been spent circling back to people he trusted, hoping one of them might do what he no longer could. Eric looked over the slope, the same terrain where Angela's remains had been found. A quiet wind rustled the trees. No cameras clicked. No voices broke the silence. This was not a moment for headlines. This was a moment for reckoning. Back at the station, Eric compiled the last report of his career. He detailed the physical evidence, the witness statements, the digital audio files, the photographic trail, and the diary entries. He attached every item with a cross-reference list and submitted it to the Federal Archive. Rachel Holt called later that evening and confirmed that the case had entered its final legal phase. Charges against Calvin Hargrove included obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder, and destruction of evidence. Though Bill Hargrove would not stand trial due to his medical condition, a full report on his role would be included in the final judgment. Angela Moss's death had been ruled a homicide with posthumous closure filed under the Fairwood County Cold Case Act. Neil's official status had been changed from missing to presumed deceased. His death, though without remains, was acknowledged as linked to his investigation. Eric stared at the computer screen for several minutes after reading the final line. He had expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt a dull ache. He did not cry. He simply sat there and listened to the hum of the old office radiator. A week passed before he visited Neil's mother. Her home was small and tucked behind a row of maple trees that had turned gold with the season. She answered the door with a soft smile and led him to the kitchen. She had followed the news quietly. She had not appeared in interviews. She had not marched with the crowds. But she had read every page. Eric placed a box on the table. Inside was everything he had recovered that belonged to Neil. The journal, the photographs, the cassette tapes. She touched each item with care, her fingers brushing the surface like she was waking up old memories rather than reviewing evidence. She asked if Eric believed Neil had been afraid. He said yes. Then she asked if Neil had died alone. Eric said he did not know, but he believed Neil had died, believing the truth would one day matter. She nodded slowly and asked if she could keep the badge. Eric said yes. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a framed photo of Neil in uniform. She placed the badge at the base of the frame. Her eyes welled, but she did not cry. Instead, she whispered that maybe now he could rest. The town changed after the trial. Not in loud ways. There were no memorial parades. There were no plaques hung on buildings. But people started speaking differently. Teachers brought up Angela's story during class discussions on ethics. Retired officers re-examined closed cases. A local artist painted a mural on the brick wall near the courthouse. It showed Angela as she had once stood in her senior portrait with Neil's silhouette beside her holding a notebook. The mural did not name them. It did not need to. The town now understood what it had ignored. Pain had lived among them for years, disguised as nostalgia. Grief had been mistaken for history. Eric walked past that mural one morning and noticed a group of students standing quietly in front of it. One girl wiped her eyes. Another placed a single white rose at the base. Eric did not interrupt. He kept walking. That was their moment now. Rachel Holt later invited Eric to speak at a closed conference for federal investigators. He initially declined. Then, 2 nights before the event, he opened Neil's final journal and reread a passage where Neil wrote about silence. Neil had believed that silence was not absence. Silence was permission. It allowed things to grow in shadow. It allowed harm to echo. Eric attended the conference. He stood behind the podium and spoke plainly. He told the story without embellishment. He said that some crimes begin not with action, but with decisions not to act. He said that justice is not only a matter of law, but of remembering. He ended by saying that when people ask what happened to Angela Moss and Neil Hargrove, the answer should not be that they were lost. The answer should be that they were found not in body alone, but in voice and memory, and in the refusal to forget. Years passed. Fairwood rebuilt its high school. The new structure included a quiet reading garden funded by anonymous donors. A bench stood beneath an old oak tree. On its brass plaque were 6 words: "Let truth rise even when it hurts." No one claimed authorship. No ceremony marked its installation. But students found it, teachers referenced it. Strangers sat there and read or thought or simply paused. Eric visited the bench on the last day of his career. He did not sit. He stood beside it and looked across the field where the old gym once stood. He reached into his coat and pulled out the last photo of Neil. Then he placed it under the bench where only someone truly searching might find it. He stepped back and walked away. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping mysteries based on chilling disappearances and buried truths, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. We would love to hear your thoughts about the plot in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story hit you the hardest.